"Let's go," she said, walking backward before turning and rushing toward home. 12:05 a.m. Sheriff John Butler stood on the rotting back deck, looking out over his backyard, the wood shifting and creaking beneath his bare feet. The adjacent houses were all dark, the neighbors and their families fast asleep. Why would they be awake? They had a sheriff living right next door. They had nothing to worry about. He found it difficult to catch his breath. The night air was warm and stagnant and weighed heavily in his chest. The sturgeon moon hung fat and low and bee-pollen yellow. Or was it called a buck moon? The sheriff couldn't remember. The last 7 days had been quiet. Too quiet. There were no burglaries, no serious motor vehicle accidents, no meth explosions, not one report of domestic abuse. Not that Blake County was a hotbed of lawlessness, but they did have their share of violent crimes. Just not this week. The first 4 days, he was grateful for the reprieve. But then it seemed downright eerie. It was odd, unsettling. For the first time in 20 years as sheriff, Butler was actually caught up on all his paperwork. "Don't go borrowing trouble," came a soft voice. Janice, Butler's wife of 32 years, slipped an arm around his waist and laid her head against his shoulder. "No danger of that," Butler said with a little laugh. "It usually finds me all on its own." "Then come back to bed," Janice said and tugged on his hand. "I'll be right in," Butler said. Janice crossed her arms over her chest and gave him a stern look. He held up his right hand. 5 more minutes, I promise." Reluctantly, Janice stepped back inside. Butler ran a calloused palm over the splintered cedar railing. The entire deck needed to be replaced, torn down to the studs and rebuilt. Maybe tomorrow he'd go to Lowe's over in Sioux City. If things continued as they were, he'd have plenty of time to rebuild the deck. Stifling a yawn, he went back inside, flipped the deadbolt, and trudged down the hall toward his bed and Janice. Another quiet night, the sheriff thought. Might as well enjoy it while it lasts. 1:09 a.m. The sound of balloons popping pulled Deb Cutter from a deep sleep. Another pop. Then another. Maybe kids playing with firecrackers left over from the 4th of July. "Randy?" she murmured. There was no answer. Deb reached for her husband, but the bed next to her was empty, the bed cover still undisturbed and cool to the touch. She slipped from beneath the sheets, went to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Randy's truck wasn't parked in its usual spot next to the milking shed. Brock's was gone too. She glanced at the clock. After midnight. Her 17-year-old son had become a stranger to her. Her sweet boy had always had a wild streak, which had turned mean. He'd be up to no good, she was sure of that. Brock was born when they were barely 18, and barely knew how to take care of themselves, let alone an infant. Deb knew that Randy was hard on Brock. Too hard at times. When he was little, it took just a stern look and a swat to get Brock back in line, but those days were long gone. The only thing that seemed to get his attention now was a smack upside the head. Deb had to admit that over the years Randy had crossed a line or two, doling out bruises, busted lips, bloody noses. But afterward, Randy always justified his harshness. Life wasn't easy, and as soon as Brock figured that out, the better. And Randy, he'd been so distant, so busy lately. Not only was Randy helping his parents out on their farm, but he was also in the process of refurbishing another old farmhouse with 6 decrepit outbuildings, a hog confine, and trying to tend to his own crops. She barely saw him during the daylight hours. Deb tried to tamper down the resentment, but it curdled in her throat. Obsessed. That was what Randy was. Obsessed with fixing up that old homestead. Obsessed with the land.